What if the most dangerous threat on the battlefield wasn't the one in front of Uba, the one you deliberately chose to ignore? 4 days, the tunnel sat there on the maps, a thin line sketched by engineers who never fully explored it, labeled as secondary, low priority, something to be dealt with later. Commandos walked past it, patrols marked it as cleared, and intelligence reports quietly downgraded its relevance. In a war filled with urgent fires to put out, this one looked cold, harmless, dormant. And that assumption felt reasonable, at least at first. From the surface, the battlefield made sense. Enemy positions were visible, supply routes were identified, and defensive lines were oriented toward the most obvious directions of attack. The tunnel didn't fit into that logic. It didn't connect to known strongholds. It didn't show recent traffic, no heat signatures, no confirmed sightings. In military planning, threats that don't immediately scream danger often get postponed, not denied, just delayed. That delay is where history starts spending, because what commanders failed to grasp wasn't the tunnel itself, but what it represented. Subterranean warfare doesn't announce itself, it waits. It thrives on patience and invisibility. While surface battles demand speed and dominance, underground warfare rewards silence, time, and psychological endurance. The enemy understood this difference perfectly. Friendly forces did not. Reports from early reconnaissance. Teams described the tunnel as old, partially collapsed, likely abandoned. One officer even joked it was a problem for engineers, not soldiers. That sentence would age badly, very badly, because in modern warfare, engineers don't just fix problems, they sometimes become the last line of defense when tactical arrogance blinds this. Every hour the tunnel remained unchecked. The enemy gained something far more valuable than territory: predictability. They learned patrol schedules. They listened to radio chatter through the earth. They mapped habits, routines, response times. While soldiers above ground believed the threat was neutralized, below the surface, a different battle was quietly being prepared. This is where the first psychological fracture occurred. When a threat is labeled as insignificant, it stops being actively questioned. It fades into background noise. And once that happens, even warning signs lose their urgency. A missing patrol here, a strange vibration there, unexplained sounds dismissed as structural shifts or distant artillery, each signal individually explainable, together a pattern no one wanted to see. Military doctrine teaches prioritization. You cannot address every possible danger at once. But it also teaches something else: never leave unknowns at your back. The tunnel violated that principle from the moment it was postponed. Yet postponement felt justified because nothing happened. Silence reinforced confidence. The absence of immediate consequences became proof that the decision was right. That's the most dangerous feedback loop in warfare. The enemy, meanwhile, was exploiting time as a weapon. They weren't rushing. They weren't reacting. They were waiting for complacency to harden into certainty. Underground, they stockpiled equipment, rehearsed routes, measured distances to key positions above. Every delay by the defenders was translated into precision for the attackers. And here's the cruel irony. If the tunnel had shown obvious activity, it would have been destroyed immediately. Its greatest defense was appearing irrelevant. By looking unfinished, forgotten, or strategically useless, it became untouchable. Not because it was protected, but because it was underestimated. When commanders later reviewed the early decisions, many admitted the same thing. We meant to deal with it eventually. That word eventually has no place in active combat zones. War doesn't punish bad intentions. It punishes bad timing. By the time anyone seriously reconsidered the tunnel, the battlefield above had already been shaped by decisions made below. The enemy didn't need to break defenses head-on. They just needed to wait for the right moment to emerge where no one was looking. And when they did, the realization would hit all at once. Before we go any further, take a moment to think about what you just heard. A single decision labeled as not urgent quietly reshaped an entire battlefield. This is exactly why understanding military history at a deeper level matters. Not just what happened, but why it happened and how similar mistakes keep repeating in modern conflicts. If this insight already made you see warfare differently, let me know right now. Drop a comment and write the tunnel if you believe the most dangerous threats are the ones commanders underestimate. Your comment tells me and the algorithm that this kind of detailed, strategic storytelling is worth continuing. And if you're finding value in this breakdown, make sure you leave a like. It's not just a button, it directly helps more people discover these hidden moments of military history that rarely make it into textbooks. If you're not subscribed yet, this is the moment to do it. This channel exists to uncover the decisions, miscalculations, and innovations that quietly changed the outcome of wars. The defenders above ground believed they controlled the battlefield because they could see it. Trenches, checkpoints, firing, arcs, patrol routes, all of it mapped, measured, and constantly reinforced. Visibility created confidence. But underground warfare operates on a completely different logic, one that doesn't value dominance of space, but dominance of time and uncertainty. And this was the mindset the enemy had mastered long before the first shot was fired. To fight beneath the surface is to fight without urgency. The enemy did not need quick victories or dramatic breakthroughs. Their advantage was patience. Every hour that passed without interference strengthened their position, while surface units rotated shifts, dealt with fatigue, and reacted to visible threats. The enemy below adjusted quietly, inch by inch, listening more than moving, learning more than acting. This wasn't improvisation, it was doctrine born from necessity. Armies that cannot win through firepower learn to win through endurance. Underground spaces neutralize technological superiority. Air support becomes irrelevant. Heavy armor loses purpose. Surveillance loses clarity. What remains is psychology, for the fear of what cannot be seen, tracked, or predicted. Inside the tunnel network, the enemy thought in layers, not just physical layers of earth and concrete, but layers of deception. Some tunnels were deliberately left unused, meant only to be discovered and dismissed. Others were designed to collapse easily, reinforcing the belief that the entire system was unstable and abandoned. The real roots stayed deeper, reinforced, silent. Every false discovery strengthened the illusion that there was nothing left to find. Above ground, commanders interpreted silence as absence. Below ground, silence was strategy. The enemy listened. Sound travels far underground, boots on gravel, generators starting, vehicles repositioning, voices echoing through soil and rock. With time, they could reconstruct daily rhythms. When guards changed, when patrols relaxed, when attention shifted elsewhere. Information gathered passively is often more reliable than intelligence collected under pressure. Every modern army fears ambush, but underground forces redefine it. They don't ambush movement. They ambush assumptions. They wait for defenders to orient all defenses outward, convinced the danger must come from the front. Only then does the tunnel become active not as an escape route, but as an offensive artery. There's another psychological element commanders often underestimate: the strain of anticipation. Soldiers can endure intense combat if it's directional and defined. What breaks morale is the idea that the ground itself is compromised, that the earth beneath you might open, that safety zones don't exist. Once that idea takes hold, discipline erodes, subtly but relentlessly. The enemy understood this. They didn't rush to exploit the tunnel. They allowed rumors to spread naturally. A sentry hearing something at night, a vibration felt but not confirmed, a patrol reporting strange acoustics. None of it concrete, enough to trigger action yet, enough to see doubt. Doubt is the first crack in any defensive system. And while defenders debated whether these signs were meaningful, the enemy rehearsed. They practiced emerging silently, timing movements with artillery noise, coordinating multiple exits to overwhelm response times. They studied how long it took for alarms to propagate, how quickly units could redeploy when surprised. Every drill underground was designed around one question: how slow is their reaction when they are caught off guard? This wasn't just about geography. It was about rewriting cause and effect. Above ground, action triggers reaction. Below ground, inaction creates inevitability. By choosing not to engage, defenders unintentionally locked themselves into a future scenario where the enemy dictated the moment of contact. And when that moment came, it wouldn't feel like an attack. It would feel like reality breaking, like the battlefield suddenly no longer obeyed its own rules. Before the enemy ever emerged, they had already won the psychological terrain. The tunnel was no longer just a structure, it was leverage, a threat that existed everywhere and nowhere at once. And soon, the surface forces would realize that the war they thought they were fighting was never the real one. At first glance, the tunnel appeared to be a dead end in every sense of the word. Reconnaissance teams entered cautiously, marked their progress with chalk and tape, and returned with reports that seemed reassuring. Collapsed sections, poor ventilation, no visible supplies, no signs of recent occupation. From a surface-level assessment, it looked unfinished, abandoned, or simply obsolete, an artifact of an earlier phase of the conflict that no longer mattered. That assumption was fatal. What those early patrols didn't realize is that underground warfare is designed to deceive the first observer, not the last one. Tunnels meant for active operations are rarely obvious. In fact, the more important the route, the more effort is spent making it look useless. Narrow passages discourage exploration. Minor cavines suggest neglect. Empty chambers reinforce the idea that there's nothing worth protecting deeper inside. The patrol reports reflected exactly what the enemy wanted them to reflect. Maps were incomplete, stitched together from aerial surveys and outdated engineering. On paper, the tunnel system ended where the collapses appeared. In reality, those collapses were intentional choke points, false terminations that redirected movement away from reinforced secondary shafts hidden behind natural rock formations or removable panels camouflaged with debris. Without specialized equipment, those access points were nearly impossible to identify under time pressure. The soldiers conducting the inspections weren't careless. They were constrained. Limited oxygen, poor lighting, orders to move fast. The tunnel inspections were treated as a checklist item, not a priority mission. Each patrol had minutes, not hours. Enough time to confirm what command already believed that the tunnel posed no immediate threat. And once that belief took hold, every subsequent observation was filtered through it. One patrol reported faint airflow deeper inside. Engineers attribute it to temperature differences. Another noted scratch marks on the walls that looked recent. They were dismissed as structural shifts or animal activity. A third patrol mentioned hearing distant metallic sounds, but without visual confirmation. The report was downgraded. None of these details were alarming on their own. Together, they painted a picture no one wanted to see. This is how false certainty forms in combat environments, not through ignorance, but through selective interpretation. Above ground, the tunnel's entrance was left unguarded, not because it was forgotten, but because it was categorized. Once something is labeled low risk, it stops generating urgency. Units rotated elsewhere. Surveillance assets were redirected. The tunnel slipped into the background of operational planning, mentioned occasionally, but never revisited with fresh eyes. Meanwhile, the enemy adapted their behavior specifically to reinforce this illusion. Movements were timed to avoid patrol windows. Supplies were transported only during periods of heavy surface activity to mask sound. Tools were padded, footsteps controlled. Nothing was rushed. The goal wasn't speed, was invisibility. One of the most dangerous aspects of subterranean warfare is that success looks exactly like failure from the outside. When defenders don't see activity, they assume there is none. Underground units measure success by how little they are noticed. Every day the tunnel went unused was not wasted time. It was confirmation that the deception was working. There is also a structural misunderstanding that often occurs. Commanders assume tunnels are meant for escape or logistics, not attack. That assumption shaped defensive posture. If the tunnel wasn't feeding supplies or evacuating personnel, it was considered strategically irrelevant. What they failed to consider was that the tunnel's true value wasn't movement, it was positioning. It allowed the enemy to choose where and when contact would occur. The patrols returned with confidence. Reports stacked up, each one reinforcing the last. The tunnel was safe. The tunnel was empty. The tunnel could wait. In military operations, repetition creates authority. Once enough reports align, dissenting details are smoothed out. Doubt becomes an inconvenience. But underground, the enemy had reached a different conclusion. The defenders were no longer curious, no longer suspicious, no longer watching. That's when preparation accelerated. Hidden chambers were stocked. Exit points were rehearsed repeatedly. Timelines were refined down 2 minutes. The tunnel that led nowhere had become a weapon aimed directly at the softest part of the defensive structure, complacency. And when the first unit finally realized the tunnel didn't end where the map said it did, it wouldn't be during an inspection. It would be during contact. The earliest warnings didn't arrive as alarms or explosions. They arrived quietly, fragmented, easy to rationalize away. That's what made them so dangerous. In warfare, the most catastrophic failures rarely begin with obvious mistakes. They begin with small irregularities that feel inconvenient rather than urgent. It started with timing. A routine patrol missed its scheduled check-in by 12 minutes. Not long enough to trigger a response, but long enough to be noted. When they finally reported in, the explanation sounded reasonable. Rough terrain, radio interference, nothing out of the ordinary. The logbook reflected that new escalation, no follow-up. Then came the sounds. Night sentries reported faint vibrations beneath their boots, subtle enough to doubt. Achi first. They blamed nearby vehicle movement or distant artillery. Later, they blamed fatigue. Underground acoustics are deceptive. Sound travels through soil in ways most surface troops aren't trained to interpret. What feels like background noise can be deliberate activity masked by depth and distance. A junior officer suggested a deeper inspection. The request stalled. Resources were stretched. There were more visible threats demanding attention. The tunnel was still categorized as inactive, and once a threat is categorized, it becomes bureaucratically difficult to uncategorize it without undeniable proof. That proof never arrives cleanly. Another patrol failed to return on time. This one longer Nilianar. When they did return, they were visibly shaken but couldn't articulate why. Their report mentioned a sense of movement and air displacement deeper in the tunnel. Those phrases raised eyebrows, but not enough to trigger action. Feelings don't move battalions. Data 2. The mistake wasn't that commanders ignored reports. It's that they interpreted them through an outdated framework. Every warning was evaluated as an isolated incident rather than a pattern. Military structures are built to filter noise, but sometimes they filter out. Meaning, then came the disappearances. A two-man observation team posted near a rear supply route failed to respond entirely. Their last transmission was routine. No distress call, no gunfire heard. When a search unit reached the position hours later, the site was undisturbed. No signs of struggle. No blood, just absence. The official conclusion leaned toward miscommunication or redeployment confusion, but absence is rarely accidental in war. The enemy was testing reaction times, probing boundaries without committing. Every unexplained delay, every missing signal, every half-answered radio call added another data point underground. Above ground, those same events were logged, filed, and mentally minimized. The system wasn't failing, it was functioning exactly as designed, and that was the problem. Even logistics began to feel off. Ammunition counts didn't line up. Supplies stored in rear areas showed signs of disturbance minor, barely noticeable. A crate shifted, a seal broken and retied. Nothing stolen, nothing damaged, just enough to create uncertainty without triggering alarms. That uncertainty should have been the signal. Experienced soldiers know that enemies rarely act without purpose. If something feels wrong but leaves no damage, it often means the damage hasn't happened yet. Still, without a visible enemy, responsibility diffused. Everyone assumed someone else was watching the problem. This is where psychological bias takes over. Once a location is deemed safe, contradicting evidence feels disruptive. It challenges authority, planning, and the comfort of certainty. Raising alarms risks being wrong, and in military culture, false alarms carry social and professional costs. So, people wait. They delay. They gather one more piece of confirmation. Underground, the enemy was counting on that delay. They adjusted based on reactions. When patrols increased briefly, activity slowed. When attention drifted, movement resumed. This wasn't random behavior. It was calibration. They were learning how much they could do without being noticed and how little they needed to do to remain invisible. The tunnel had become more than an access route. It was now an intelligence tool. By the time a senior officer finally acknowledged that something doesn't feel right, the situation had already crossed a threshold. The enemy wasn't preparing anymore. they were ready. And the most terrifying realization came too late. Every warning sign had been accurate. Every dismissed report had been a piece of the truth. The battlefield hadn't been quiet. It had been holding its breath. The moment it happened, no one understood it all at once. That's the nature of surprise in combat. It arrives fragmented, disorienting, impossible to process in real time. 1 second, the defensive line was holding. The next, the battlefield violated its own logic. The first contact didn't come from the front. There was no warning barrage, no build-up of fire, no obvious breach. It came from behind the lines, where weapons weren't aimed and attention was lowest. A single explosion tore through a rear position that had been classified as secure. Not a heavy detonation, precise, controlled, surgical, enough to create confusion without revealing scale. Then the tunnel spoke. Enemy fighters didn't rush out in waves. They emerged in disciplined bursts, exactly where response time would be slowest. Command posts, ammunition staging areas, communication nodes, places designed to function, not fight. In seconds, the assumptions that held the defense together began to unravel. Radio traffic exploded. Conflicting reports flooded command channels. Units reported enemy contact from directions that some believed they were being flanked. Others thought friendly forces had made a catastrophic navigation error. No one immediately realized the truth that the enemy wasn't moving around the defenses, but through them. This is where subterranean warfare becomes devastating. Traditional defense relies on orientation. You protect what's in front of you and secure what's behind you. The tunnel erased that distinction. There was no rear anymore. The enemy was everywhere they were, never expected to be. Soldiers reacted instinctively. Some turned to engage threats behind them, exposing their original fronts. Others held position, waiting for orders that couldn't arrive because communication lines were already compromised. Every response created a new vulnerability. Every second of hesitation amplified the damage, and the enemy knew exactly how long that hesitation would last. They had timed it, measured it, rehearsed it on the ground. Within minutes, command cohesion fractured. Officers attempted to reassert control, but orders contradicted each other. Maps were suddenly useless. Defensive grids meant nothing when the enemy didn't respect surface geometry. Units trying to respond to visible threats struggled against an opponent who refused to be seen until it was too late. Psychological shock hit harder than the fire itself. Soldiers are trained for chaos, but not for betrayal by terrain. The ground beneath them, something assumed constant, had become hostile. That realization spreads fast, faster than fear, faster than discipline. Once the idea takes hold that the battlefield is compromised at its foundation, confidence collapses. Some units attempted to seal the tunnel exits blindly, firing into darkness, dropping explosives without knowing the layout. Others tried to fall back, only to encounter enemy elements emerging ahead of them. Movements collided, friend and foe blurred. In a matter of moments, the defenders were no longer responding to a single threat. They were reacting to uncertainty itself. This is the brilliance and the cruelty of the tunnel strategy. The enemy didn't need numerical superiority. They didn't need sustained engagement. They needed disruption. A few minutes of confusion did more damage than hours of direct assault ever could. By the time commanders fully grasped what was happening, The enemy had already begun to withdraw back into the tunnel network. They didn't linger. That wasn't the goal. The goal was to prove a point. The defenses were porous, predictable, and psychologically fragile. What remained above ground was not defeat but instability. Trust in the defensive layout was gone. Every shadow became suspect. Every vibration triggered tension. Units that once moved confidently now hesitated, and that hesitation would shape every decision that followed. The tunnel hadn't just delivered an attack. It had rewritten the rules of the fight. What happened next was the defeat in the traditional sense. There was no single order to retreat, no clear moment when the line officially broke. Instead, the defense unraveled piece by piece, decision by decision, as the system tried and failed to adapt faster than the situation was changing. The first failure was command synchronization. Once the enemy emerged from the tunnel and struck multiple rear positions, the chain of command fractured almost instantly. Units began reporting contradictory information at the same time. Some claimed the enemy was withdrawing. Others insisted the attack was expanding. A few reported contact in areas that, according to maps, shouldn't even exist as access points. Commanders were forced to make decisions with incomplete data, and worse, with data that contradicted itself. In conventional engagements, uncertainty shrinks as contact increases. Here, it expanded. Every new report added confusion instead of clarity. That confusion bled directly into movement. Quick reaction forces were deployed, but deployed toward the wrong coordinates. By the time they arrived, the enemy was already gone, having melted back into the tunnel network. Other units redeployed preemptively, creating gaps in sectors that had previously been secure. Those gaps triggered new alerts, new redeployments, and new vulnerabilities. The defense wasn't collapsing because of firepower. It was collapsing because it was chasing ghosts. Then came friendly interference. As units shifted rapidly without shared situational awareness, coordination broke down. Fields of fire overlapped unexpectedly. Identification protocols slowed reactions. Soldiers hesitated, unsure whether movement ahead was hostile, friendly, or something emerging from the ground itself. In at least one instance, two friendly elements nearly engaged each other before realizing they were responding to the same false alarm. The tunnel had turned the defenders against their own tempo. Communication infrastructure suffered next, not because it was destroyed outright, but because it became overloaded. Command nets filled with urgent requests, clarifications, and repeated confirmations. Orders had to be reissued. Updates arrived late. Some units stopped waiting altogether and began acting independently. That independence, while understandable, accelerated fragmentation. Every autonomous decision created ripple effects. A unit pulling back triggered concern in adjacent sectors. A sudden surge forward exposed flanks. The defense lost its shape. And once a defense loses shape, it loses predictability. The very thing that holds disciplined formations together under stress. The enemy exploited this without even being present. They didn't need to continue attacking. The mere possibility that they could reemerge at any moment forced the defenders into a reactive posture. Resources were spread thin. Attention was divided. Every tunnel, exit trail, or suspected demanded coverage. There were never enough troops to cover them all. This is where tactical collapse becomes self-signing. The more the defense tried to compensate, the more complex and fragile it became. Orders multiplied. Rules of engagement tightened. Movement slowed. Initiative disappeared. Soldiers began waiting for confirmation instead of acting decisively, because acting decisively had already led to mistakes. Morale didn't break dramatically. It eroded quietly. Veteran soldiers described this phase as the most exhausting kind of combat. Constant alertness without contact. Adrenaline with nowhere to go. The sense that danger could appear at any point, from any direction, without warning. Sleep suffered. Judgment dulled. Confidence bled away. By the time leadership attempted to stabilize the situation, the battlefield had fundamentally changed. The enemy had proven they could penetrate the defense at will. The tunnel had become an omnipresent threat, even when empty, and perhaps most damaging of all, trust was gone. Trust in maps. Trust in rear areas. Trust in the idea that the battle had boundaries. The defense was still standing, but it was no longer coherent, and that incoherence would force the next desperate move, sealing the underground threat at any cost, with limited time, limited information, and mounting pressure. Once the tunnel was identified as the true center of gravity, the tone of command shifted from control to urgency. This was no longer about stabilizing lines or restoring order. It was about eliminating a threat that had already proven it could bypass every conventional defense. And that urgency came with a dangerous side effect: improvisation under pressure. The first decision was made quickly and with incomplete information. Seal the tunnel. Collapse it. Make it unusable. How didn't matter, yet only that it had to happen before the enemy used it again. Engineers were summoned. Infantry units reassigned. Explosives diverted from other priorities. No one had a full no. Juan knew how deep it ran, how many branches it had, or how many exits were still hidden. That uncertainty didn't slow the operation. It accelerated it. Demolition teams were ordered to place charges at the most obvious access points. These were surface-level solutions to a subsurface problem. Explosives were calculated based on visible structure, not hidden reinforcement. When the charges detonated, sections of the tunnel collapsed exactly as expected near the entrance. Deeper inside, nothing changed. The blast pressure dissipated before reaching the real arteries. Command interpreted the explosions as success. That assumption lasted less than an hour. New enemy movement was detected, this time from a secondary exit that no one had confirmed existed. The tunnel wasn't a single passage. It was a system, and by collapsing one section, defenders had unintentionally redirected enemy movement toward exits. They weren't watching at all. This is where underground warfare punishes haste. As additional collapse attempts followed, the tunnel became more unstable, but not in the way defenders wanted. Partial collapses created new choke points, tighter spaces that favored defenders in theory, but also allowed smaller enemy units to move silently and emerge in unexpected locations. Dust clouds from detonations masked sound, debris muffled movement. Every attempt to solve the problem made detection harder. Infantry units were then sent inside. These weren't specialized subterranean teams. They were regular soldiers trained for surface combat, suddenly ordered into confined, unfamiliar terrain with limited visibility and unreliable communication. Radios failed almost immediately. Signals didn't penetrate deep enough. Runners got lost. Time estimates became meaningless. Inside the tunnel, fear took on a different shape. There were no clear fronts, no horizons, just darkness, tight angles, and the constant awareness that the enemy knew this environment better. Every step forward felt exposed. Every sound echoed unpredictably. Soldiers reported the sensation that the tunnel itself was alive, breathing, shifting, waiting. Contact inside the tunnel was brief and violent. Short bursts of fire, grenades detonated in confined spaces, amplifying pressure and disorientation. Smoke lingered far longer than expected. In at least one engagement, friendly units lost orientation completely and had to retreat blindly, guided only by the slope of the ground and the faint memory of where they had entered. Above ground, commanders waited for updates that didn't come. Minutes stretched into hours. Without feedback, assumptions filled the gap. Some believed the tunnel was cleared. Others suspected catastrophic losses. Neither was fully true. The reality was worse. The tunnel was now contested, unstable, and unpredictable. No one fully controlled it. Meanwhile, the enemy adapted again. They stopped using the tunnel for movement and began using it as a trap. Collapsed sections forced defenders into narrow corridors. Familiar routes disappeared. What had once been a strategic advantage became a psychological weapon, one that punished intrusion as much as neglect. The effort to seal the tunnel had achieved one thing. It removed any illusion that this was a simple engineering problem. It was a combat domain of its own, demanding doctrine, training, and patience that no longer existed under the current pressure. And as casualties mounted, both physical and psychological, another realization began to spread through the ranks. Even if the tunnel could be sealed, the damage had already been done. The ground could no longer be trusted. The most lasting damage didn't come from explosions or firefights. It came from the change in how soldiers felt about the ground they stood on. Once the tunnel revealed itself as an active threat, the battlefield transformed into something far more exhausting than chaos, a place where certainty no longer existed. Every position became provisional. Soldiers who had once slept in relative calm now slept in fragments, waking at every unfamiliar sound. A shifting rock, a distant vibration, a muffled echo that couldn't be traced. Each noise carried the same question. Is this nothing, or is it the start of something? That question, unanswered, drained energy faster than combat ever could. Patrol behavior changed almost immediately. Movements became slower, more cautious. Units doubled back more often, checking their own tracks, scanning the ground as much as the horizon. Time that had once been spent observing the enemy was now spent observing the terrain itself. The battlefield demanded attention in all directions, at all times. This constant vigilance came at a cost. Decision-making slowed. Soldiers hesitated before committing to actions that once felt routine. Crossing open ground, entering buildings, establishing temporary positions. Every choice required recalculation, not just of visible threats, but of what might exist below. That mental load accumulated quietly, degrading reaction speed and confidence. The enemy didn't need to attack again to maintain pressure. The tunnel had become a rumor machine. Stories circulated through units, some accurate, others exaggerated. A squad claimed they heard voices underground. Another swore they felt air moving beneath a defensive position. A third insisted an entire enemy team vanished back into the earth seconds before contact. Even when unverified, these stories shaped behavior. Fear doesn't need proof. It needs plausibility. Leadership struggled to counter this effect. Official briefings emphasized control and containment. Commanders spoke of localized threats and managed risks. But soldiers trusted their senses more than they had seen the enemy emerge where no one expected them. Once that happens, words lose weight. Experience replaces doctrine. Morale didn't collapse it. Fractured, some soldiers became hyperaggressive, overreacting to minor stimuli, firing into shadows, demanding constant movement. Others withdrew psychologically, doing only what was required, conserving energy in anticipation of the next shock. Both reactions strained unit cohesion. When fear expresses itself differently in different people, coordination suffers. The tunnel also eroded trust between units. Rear area troops felt exposed and resentful, believing frontline units had left them vulnerable. Frontline units, in turn, believed rear areas were now liabilities rather than support. The traditional hierarchy of danger front lines, risky rear areas safe, no longer applied. Everyone felt equally vulnerable, but unequally prepared. Sleep deprivation amplified everything. Night operations became torture. Darkness already heightens anxiety. Combined with the idea of underground movement, it created a sense of being surrounded even when alone. Soldiers reported dreams of the ground opening, of being pulled under, of fighting enemies they couldn't see. Those dreams followed them into waking hours. The enemy understood this impact intuitively. They reduced their activity precisely when fear peaked. No movement, no sound, no contact. Silence became another weapon. Soldiers waited for something to happen, and when it didn't, the waiting itself became unbearable. Anticipation without resolution is one of the most corrosive psychological states in combat. Over time, this pressure reshaped discipline. Procedures became rigid, sometimes irrationally so. Units demanded additional confirmation before acting. Initiative declined. Creativity narrowed. When fear dominates, people cling to rules even when rules no longer fit the situation. By the time any sense of normalcy returned, the damage was already embedded. Soldiers no longer viewed the battlefield as a defined space with known dangers. They viewed it as a living system capable of betrayal at any moment. And that shift would outlast the tunnel itself. Because even after the ground fell silent again, the memory didn't. The attack didn't just expose a tactical failure. It exposed a doctrinal blind spot that could no longer be ignored. Once the tunnel proved capable of bypassing firepower, formations, and traditional defensive depth, military leadership faced an uncomfortable truth. Existing doctrine had been built for a battlefield that no longer fully existed. Until that moment, subterranean threats were treated as secondary concerns. Engineering problems, logistical annoyances. Something to be mapped, flagged, and addressed when time allowed. The tunnel shattered that hierarchy. It demonstrated that underground spaces weren't supporting elements of warfare. They were active, decisive domains. The first response was reactive. New orders flooded down the chain of command, often contradictory and incomplete. Units were told to increase ground surveillance while also reinforcing overhead observation. Engineers were instructed to locate and neutralize subterranean structures, but without standardized methods. Intelligence units were tasked with predicting underground movement using tools designed for surface analysis. None of it fit cleanly. The problem wasn't effort. It was framework. Military systems are excellent at refining known threats. They struggle when the threat demands a new way of thinking. Underground warfare didn't just add a layer, it inverted assumptions. Depth replaced distance. Patience replaced speed. Silence replaced firepower. After-action reports began reflecting this shift. Language changed first. Tunnels were no longer described as auxiliary or supportive. They were labeled as maneuver corridors, operational zones, areas of denial. That semantic shift mattered. Words define priority, and priority drives resources. Training manuals followed slowly. Units began incorporating subterranean awareness drills, not just how to clear tunnels, but how to think about them. Soldiers were taught to read ground anomalies, understand their flow, recognize vibration patterns, and treat unexplained silence as potential activity rather than reassurance. The battlefield was redefined as three-dimensional, with vertical threads both above and below. Doctrine also absorbed the psychological lesson. Commanders learned that even a dormant tunnel could exert influence. Control wasn't just about sealing entrances. It was about denying the enemy the ability to shape perception. That meant constant monitoring, visible countermeasures, and transparency with troops. Silence and ambiguity, once tolerated, were now recognized as vulnerabilities. Perhaps the most significant change came in planning philosophy. Instead of asking, "Is this tunnel active?" planners began asking, "What happens if it becomes active at the worst possible moment?" That shift transformed how rear areas were designed, how reserves were positioned, and how response times were calculated. Were no longer postponed. They were stress-tested. But doctrine doesn't change overnight. There was resistance. Some officers argued that tunnel was an exception, not a rule, a rare convergence of conditions. Others warned against overcorrecting, against letting one incident distort broader strategy. Those debates mattered, but they couldn't erase what had already happened, because the enemy had proven something irreversible. A force operating underground could dictate tempo without constant engagement. And once that lesson is learned, it can't be unlearned. The tunnel forced militaries to confront a fundamental vulnerability, not in equipment or manpower, but in imagination. The failure wasn't just tactical. It was conceptual. The defenders hadn't believed the ground itself could be used against them in such a deliberate way. That belief changed. Future conflicts would reflect it. Planning cells would flag subterranean risks early. Intelligence would prioritize underground indicators. Specialized units would be trained not just to fight below ground, but to deny its psychological leverage above ground. But all of that progress came after the cost was paid, and the final question remained unresolved. How many lives have been lost, not because the tunnel existed, but because it was left for later, long after the tunnel was neutralized, long after maps were redrawn and protocols rewritten? One question continued to surface in every serious debrief: was this affair really about the tunnel? Because when analysts stripped the event down to its core, the structure itself wasn't a true failure. The failure was the decision to label something as secondary, non-urgent, later. In warfare, that label is rarely neutral. It is often lethal. The tunnel was not ignored because commanders were incompetent. It was ignored because it didn't fit the dominant mental model of how the war was supposed to be fought. Armies plan around what they recognize. They prioritize what they understand. Anything that sits outside that framework becomes invisible, not intentionally, but functionally. That is how secondary threats are born. They are not threats without danger. They are threats without status. The tunnel did not challenge firepower. It challenged imagination. It forced leaders to confront the uncomfortable reality that the enemy was not obligated to fight symmetrically, visibly, or according to established logic. And because that reality was inconvenient, it was postponed. History is full of these moments. mines dismissed as harassment until supply routes collapsed, drones underestimated until air defenses became obsolete, cyber intrusions ignored until entire command networks went dark. The pattern is always the same. A threat appears unconventional, inefficient, or limited. It is logged, acknowledged, deep, and while attention remains fixed elsewhere, that threat matures quietly into a decisive factor. What magi? The tunnel, especially dangerous, was not its complexity, but its simplicity. It required no advanced technology, no overwhelming manpower, just time, discipline, and a deep understanding of human behavior. The enemy knew that as long as the tunnel remained for later, it remained untouchable. Once contact occurred, the cost became visible, but by then it was irreversible. Lives were lost not during the initial emergence, but in the cascading consequences that followed. Confusion-led engagements, friendly fire incidents narrowly avoided or not avoided at all, psychological exhaustion that dulled judgment weeks later. Every downstream effect traced back to a single decision. We'll deal with it later. That phrase appears in more operational failures than any technical error ever has. The most sobering realization came afterward, when planners recognized that even if the tunnel had never been used, it still should have been treated as decisive terrain. Because in modern conflict, potential is often more dangerous than action. A dormant threat shapes behavior the moment it is understood. The tunnel proved that wars are no longer fought solely where forces collide, but where assumptions collapse. And that lesson did not stay buried underground. Today, militaries around the world train specifically against what used to be called secondary threats. Subterranean warfare, hybrid tactics, gray zone operations, ACE are all attempts to formalize lessons learned the hard way. Not because they are new, but because ignoring them has repeatedly proven catastrophic. Yet even now, the temptation remains to postpone the unfamiliar, to downgrade the inconvenient, to focus on what looks urgent instead of what could become decisive. That temptation has not disappeared. It has simply changed form. The tunnel was never just a structure. It was a warning about how wars are lost, not through overwhelming force, but through delayed understanding, about how enemies exploit not weakness, but certainty, and about how the most dangerous moments in conflict often begin with silence, not fire. So, the real lesson isn't tactical. It's cognitive. If something on the battlefield feels out of place, unfinished, or irrelevant, that may be exactly where the next disaster is waiting. If you've made it this far, you've witnessed how a single tunnel ignored, underestimated, and postponed could rewrite the rules of an entire battlefield. Now, it's your turn to engage. Comment below with the tunnel if you recognize that the most dangerous threats are often the ones we choose to ignore. Share your thoughts. What would you have done differently if you were in command? If this breakdown gave you a new perspective on strategy, history, or decision-making under pressure, make sure you leave a like. Your support helps this channel continue uncovering hidden moments of military history that textbooks often overlook. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss future videos that reveal the decisions, innovations, and mistakes that quietly change the course of wars. Finally, hit the next video appearing on your screen. Watch it to discover even more moments where strategy, patience, and unseen threats shaped history in ways few could anticipate. Your journey into the hidden side of warfare is just beginning.